Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum on this drippy, and then sunny, and then drippy, and then sunny, and then storming day. I think I was just talking with Mitch. I think I drove through 4 different weather patterns between Virgins and here. But that's the nature of the beast this time of year. And hopefully it comes with a slight break in humidity. We'll see. Yeah, well, I think it's, all day we watch storms go north and south of here at the museum campus. And then finally this one caught us. So, very excited today to welcome a fellow team member and colleague here at the Maritime Museum, Taylor Picard, to talk about their research on Army crash boats, which is the topic which introduced me to Taylor. Yeah. Taylor reached out to me in the Maritime Museum probably in 2020?
2020, yeah.
About the fact that we have a crash boat here in Lake Champlain that's sunken. And then I was able to bring Taylor to the museum as an intern in 2021 to do photogrammetry, to be a photogrammetry intern. Of course, that was right in the heart of pandemic lifestyle, so actually didn't see Taylor all that often because we worked remotely and at different times. And then I was overjoyed to bring Taylor back in 2023 as a staff member to join us. So, in June of 24.
June of 24.
23 came back and helped us excavate the Congress down in Arnold's Bay, and then came back as a full-time employee in 2024. So I always get great professional satisfaction out of working with somebody as an intern or as a student, and then seeing them matriculate and become professional archaeologists. There's nothing that's much more heartwarming than that. Having a piece of that come back to us is always very nice. So very excited to hear this presentation along with you tonight about Army crash boats. And here's Taylor Picard.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for breaking the storm. It's definitely kind of a wild one out there, as Chris mentioned. So I found out that I have to have a little bit shortened my expectations of my chat, so I might move a little fast and skip some things. I aimed for an hour, and I didn't realize it was about 35 minutes that I should be shooting for. But yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you guys about crash boats tonight. So, what do you mean a crash boat? Well, for me to answer this question, I have to kind of tell you a little bit of a story of how I learned about crash boats. So, when I was a MA candidate at the East Carolina University's program of Maritime Studies, I started working on my thesis, which is looking at that wreck there on your right, which is called the Sea Scout wreck. It was a pretty mysterious little wreck. And if you don't know, Mallows Bay, Maryland, was as recently as 2019, nominated as a National Marine Sanctuary. It was the first one in kind of a big lull where NOAA was reworking their whole program. So instead of being the sole managers of these sanctuaries, they wanted to start working with the states and tribes and nonprofit groups. So this is the first one that came out under that model. Another one just also came up on the other side of New York. So the reason they decided to make Mallows Bay a National Marine Sanctuary is because, let me make sure, right here, this is actually Mallows Bay right there, that tiny little guy. There's almost 300 shipwrecks packed in there into a massive ship graveyard. Most of these shipwrecks belong to the World War I Emergency Fleet Corporation, which were big wooden steamboats that we built in the 19-teens to send supplies to Europe to support the war effort, and I think one of them got finished in time. So obviously, at some point, the government had to decide what are we going to do with wooden-hulled, coal-burning steamboats when gasoline is now the new fuel of propulsion. Well, they decided to sell them. and most of the time they would sell big lots of them for the price of one cost of one boat. So at some point there was a company that bought them. They were actually kept here at White taking on. And yeah, there I am following him in a float. I'll tell you, the Potomac River in May, not the good time to wear a 3 mil wetsuit. Very cold. So this is a close-up of the burning basin. We're trying to figure out, what is this boat? It's so weird. So we know, we locked down that it was not there in 1977, and it shows up in 1980. All right. So it is, we know now, the last known ship to be abandoned in Mallows Bay. So I decided I'm going to make some 3D models of it. So these are CAD models that I made of the wreck, which helped us better understand the wreck, but has also helped me really understand what crash boats are and what we want to be looking for when we find a crash boat and how to identify them. And as I'll talk about later in the presentation, how we can use these models to sort of give us a better understanding of crash boat wreck sites. We also made a photogrammetry model. Obviously, it is just above the waterline. The visibility was so bad because we were right at the mouth of this creek in an eroding bank, which is what actually caused that whole vessel to list the way it's listing. That you would put your just face in the water and you could only see the tip of your finger on your mask. So we did not collect any underwater data. So, as I mentioned, we had some dates of when this wreck was abandoned. And we also have this narrative that the Sea Scouts in Alexandria, Virginia, had this boat, that they were using. And as I delved into it, it did turn out that they apparently did have a crash boat. So this is potentially the Naval Cadet ship Morris Springer, named after the founder of the unit here in Alexandria, Virginia. This is the Virginia Torpedo Factory, which is now a big art museum. And you can see right there is our humble crash boat, which is there in this image and there in that image. And so that's when it shows up in 1959. Which corresponds to the date that around the date that the unit got their boat, and then this is the last time it's seen at dock in 1977, and we have a bit of a gap in 1981. It's gone now. So this does correspond, as you saw in the other image. The Sea Scout wreck appears in 79. Oh, sorry, isn't there in 79? It appears in 1980. So I built a rough model. I call it rough because I'm really trying to build it off of this tiny image right here. And one other one where you see just kind of like a sliver of it on the starboard side. So we had a possible identity. But I still need to understand what crash boats are. And to really understand that, I have to kind of dive into the history of naval aviation, because that's where these are tied to. So naval aviation really started right before World War I, and it's during World War I that we see the first start of these types of vessels dedicated to rescuing aircraft crews. If I recall correctly, it's actually the Italians that developed these vessels first, because they specialized in fast, small attack craft. And that specialty would carry on into World War II and provide quite the nuisance for the American fleet in the Mediterranean. So there are a lot of different types. This is actually a British variant here, but it does look similar to our 63 and 85. But even different branches have different styles. So what we're talking about is U.S. Army Air Force, but the Navy had their own, which are a totally different style and have kind of more of a sled look to them. You know, the other nations, allied nations, the British, the French, had their own variations as well. So their primary role is, to support aerial missions and rescue down crews. But they also had an interesting history of these secondary operations, which is scouting and reconnaissance, supporting amphibious landings, and also covert operations. But they also saw some really interesting post-war uses, including target practice, and also 2 Sea Scout vessels. And we'll actually talk about 2, well, we already talked about one, but we'll talk about a second one that was a Sea Scout vessel. Not quite these variants, but a later version that came around in the 50s. And one that may possibly have been target practice. So, to talk about the start of naval aviation, turn of the century, we start harvesting the ability to fly, right? And right off the bat, we want to push the limit. So we decide, let's fly a plane off a boat. So this is where we get Eugene Ely in 1910, does the first takeoff off a stationary boat. The next year, he has the first landing on a stationary boat. The following year, Royal Navy Commander Charles Sampson has the first successful takeoff of a moving boat, and he's also sort of the big developer in the hydroplane, or seaplane, which is relevant later on. And then in 1917, during the First World War, we have the first successful landing on a moving ship by E.H. Dunning. Unfortunately, when he attempted this 5 days later, he died. So what they ended up focusing on during the First World War are these seaplanes. So as we enter the First World War, we see a lot of coastal Air Force bases, seaplanes being deployed from ships. We see the first successful raid by seaplanes of ships launched from the INJ Wakamaya, and it just literally would drop these planes off of cranes into the water, and they would go during the Battle of Ting Sao against the German forces. They would fly over and just drop bombs off this side of the plane. And they were actually fairly successful in damaging mine layers and other German fortifications. The British actually have the first successful raid launching planes off of a ship. This is during the Tundra raid in 1918, right at the end of the war. And they were able to damage several German ships and fortifications. So during the interwar years, we see a whole buildup of carrier-based aircraft. Both Japan and America and England even see this as the next route in military development and say, we need to focus on this. So we developed a whole range of naval aircraft. They have these big folding wings, so they can be stored on ships. And we start thinking, well, what happens when our planes crash in the water? Well, we need to be able to go rescue these crews. So we start developing what's the first sort of prototype of an aircraft rescue boat by the Navy is called a sea sled. And it's sort of like a modern pontoon boat in a way. It literally just has 2 kind of big V shapes that lift the boat out of the water, and as it goes, it sort of hovers, it flies across the water. Apparently, they were horrible to ride in because you're just hitting every single wave, sort of like a lily sheep. As World War II comes around, the very early battles reveal this important of air-to-surface attack in these naval battles, right? So having our ships launch off of carriers and go attack a target and then come back. However, these planes are small. They have limited payload ability. So, these missions were pretty risky. They were on the back that could carry up to 2 tons, and they would, if they could salvage the plane, they would hook it up and tow it back to shore. So they had 2 primary methods. The BPN Mariner would go fly over a crash site and drop rafts and supplies to the pilots, and they would flash signals to the crash boat crews, who would speed out there and go rescue the pilots and provide that immediate triage. The second one is they would follow the flight paths. If they knew there was a major mission going, they would follow behind the behind the planes, and do sort of patrols along those routes and pick up down crews as they saw them coming down. Finally, there would be standard patrol routes anywhere that there was just regular air traffic. This was really big in Alaska, actually, where the environmental conditions were so harsh, pilots had minutes, that the crash boats would just have whole regions that they would just constantly patrol in case a plane went down. And they would just be on this sort of constant patrol. This allowed them to provide that snappy, fast first aid response that these pilots need. Interestingly enough, this is where a big difference between the 63 and 85 foot variant and the 104 foot variant come in. The 104 foot is a lot slower. It's not that immediate response craft. However, it has that larger infirmary. So the difference really sort of shifts what their focus is on. So the 63 and the 85 are really focused on grabbing those fighter pilots that are going down. They need to be fast, they need to be swift, they need to get out there and grab them. Where the 104 really is the one that's taking on these large patrol jobs and following the flight paths, specifically for bomber missions. Their infirmary is almost the exact size to fit the crew for 2 to 3 bombers, depending on the size of a bomber. And they would go for several days on the water, just on these patrols, because they had 3 huge 1,300-gallon tanks on board. And they could just cruise and go for days, and they actually had whole functioning ice boxes on board, which is a pretty new technology for a small boat to have. So, interestingly enough, though, people recognized the effectiveness of these boats and decided, what if we have them do other things? So they were really popular in these big scouting missions to try and identify incoming aerial attacks, because they were already out on patrol. They could radio or signal it back in and say, hey, the enemy's coming, they're sending planes, they're about to attack. They could intercept raiders, specifically that what's talked about is them intercepting German E-boats, which are their fast attack vessels, and the Italian speedboats. And later on in the war, they would actually participate in sub-chasing operations. And we'll talk about some of the modifications, but they would eventually get these big 20-millimeter cannons added to the bow and stern end of the vessels. A very interesting story actually comes from their amphibious landing support jobs. When we landed in Tunisia, the Army colonel that was in charge of the landings was actually on a 63-foot variant, and he just went back and forth with a big loudspeaker along the landing zone and was constantly giving pinpoint directions. And this is because the 63-foot variant could go 54 knots when it's unloaded. So that's where I'm like, I think the Navy missed out not going with their variant for the PT boat. The 85-foot variant was also pretty close to it. The 104-foot, not so much. That one has to do with the fact that they did not get the Packer Hewitt engines that the PT boats have, so they ended up going quite a bit slower. They had about 2/3 of the horsepower that the PT boats had for those ones. But they would also ferry supplies into the landing zone and then carry wounded out. They were actually pretty common at D-Day, where they would be bringing in supplies to the troops that were landing because they could rush in there, get those troops that were on the beach the supplies they need, and then move their critical patients back inland to the hospital ships that were in the back line, and just really help that immediate triage pipeline, basically. Then finally, we have the covert operations, and this is actually kind of my favorite part of their sort of side history. They would deliver and retrieve commandos, take part in special operations, work with the OSS and beach jumpers, and they would also do diversion tactics for these amphibious assaults, particularly for Operation Husky and Overlord. There's a great story with these boats where during, I believe it's Operation Husky, they were going back and forth and staged a fake landing. Deploy these fake landing craft that they were towing behind them, and they would come in sweeping towards the beach and detach them, and they would have these landing craft that would just, these fake landing craft that would go in, and the Germans were just, stunned. Like, they were just, oh my goodness, there's an attack happening right now, and that actually opened the landing zones. We're able to see that the Germans were moved enough soldiers and supplies from the actual landing zones to these fake zones that really allowed the Americans to punch through. So, at the very beginning, in 1943, when the Americans are first entering the war, and we have these boats, and we're in the Mediterranean, we're kind of a mess. We don't know what's going on, and we really need to kind of get our act together. So they don't have anything on board. They don't actually have any guns or any weapons or anything like that. They're totally undefended. The ice boxes were prone to failing in that first year. So what the crash boat crews would do is they would go to all of the American depots, and they would just effectively be pirates. They would just go grab whatever they want. They'd grab extra rations. If there were just 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns laying around, they would just grab those. And in fact, this is one of my other favorite stories about these. They would grab bazookas whenever they could find them, because they were so afraid of the E-boats and the U-boats that they're like, oh yeah, we'll grab a bazooka and we'll fight them off with a bazooka, which has an effective range of like 200 feet. I would not want to be 200 feet of either an E-boat or a U-boat, but apparently it worked, and I got into a huge debate about this, of if it would be effective, and at the effective firing range of American M3 bazooka at that time, it could actually punch through the hull of a U-boat. But also, if you think about it, a U-boat's not going to shoot a torpedo at a tiny little boat going 54 knots. It's definitely going to be the deck crew, and I would not want to be the deck crew getting shot at by its bazooka. That would be pretty frightening. So, it makes sense. It's sort of fear tactics, right? So, later on in the war, they realized these are actually incredibly effective sub-chasers, but they're also relatively threatened by submarines, because if they're committing a rescue operation and they're stopped and they're rescuing down crew, the submarine U-boat comes up, they're bait, right? They're just right there in the open, and that deck crew can go after them. So they decided we're going to arm them with depth charges and 20mm cannons, first on the foredeck and then on the aft deck, specifically for the 104-foot vessels. When they committed their covert operations, such as staging those fake amphibious assaults, they actually replaced the infirmary with an armory and added extra bunks for the Seabees and the extra crew that were coming, and remove all non-essential equipment. They would actually paint the hull dark gray or black and put canvas over all the portholes so no light could get out. And then they would add this decoy equipment. So this is actually one of those smoke makers that I mentioned earlier that they used during Operation Husky. So the problem is they would do this, and then they come back from the mission, they have to repaint it all over again. Which the official color was like a bright yellow and orange. That would suck to paint black time and time again. Once the war ended, they actually were fairly popular. You know, the Army had to just big sell off and decide they didn't want any more of them. It only took, you know, about a decade before the U.S. Army Air Force would branch off and would create the United States Air Force in the 1950s. And this is sort of where a lot of these sort of just dissipated and kind of went out into the public. And during the Korean War, I forgot to mention, this image right here is actually a picture of a 104-foot crash boat during the Korean War, committing a, they were actually rescuing commandos in North Korea that they had helped insert about a week before. Well, as the Korean War progresses and we start developing helicopter technology, we have to actually, they decided we're going to switch out these rescue boats for ones that can support helicopters and have helicopter pads and things like that, because they were finding that was an even faster response time. And for those that have seen MASH, you probably understand. So a lot of them ended up being converted to supply boats. Those that did remain were then sold off, and they kind of decided that, you know, they would use these as target practice. They actually, a lot of them had very similar profiles to Soviet missile boats. And so as the Cold War started to come up, they decided, well, we'll use our surplus of these boats that we can't get rid of anymore as target practice. And there's some evidence to suggest that it even started in the 40s. This will be important later. But a large number were sold off to foreign nations and private individuals. If you're a fan of McHale's Navy, you've actually seen 2 of them. Fun fact, there was not a single PT boat used in McHale's Navy. There were 2 63-foot crash boats and a motor torpedo boat designed by the British, built by the Americans, and intended to be sold to the Soviets under the Lend-Lease Act. The motor torpedo boat is the one that you always saw underway, but anytime they were doing a shot inland, it was one of the 63-foot. Because they are very similar, as we saw. Another really famous one is one known as the MV Christmas Seal. And this is it right here. It is in fact a 104-foot. I'm a little bit uncertain which variant it is because how heavily modified it was later on. I kind of think it's the 235A, based off the shorter pilot house and a couple of features here in the back. But it was bought by the Newfoundland Tuberculosis Association in 1947 from the Army. And its whole goal was to go to the isolated outports in Newfoundland and screen for tuberculosis, because at that time, that was one of the leading causes of death on the islands. So they provided essential medical screening, care and prevention for both TB, polio, and diabetes. In fact, there were whole communities that MV Christmas Seal was their medical provider. They didn't have any other medical provider except for when Christmas Seal was at dock. In fact, we know MV Christmas Seal was so successful at its job because in 1947 there were over 500 TB deaths in Newfoundland, and this dropped down drastically to 64 in 1958. Unfortunately, as roads were developed and bridges were developed, it was sold in 1970. Also TB, we were becoming more effective with our vaccinations and our treatment, so the need for it went down. And it later actually operated as a survey vessel for the Bradford Institute of Oceanography. However, in 1976, it exploded, caught fire, and sank. Thankfully, all the crew were rescued and saved, but it is down in the water somewhere. Supposedly, there's a piece of this used in the six-string nation guitar, if you're familiar with that, which has pieces of wood from all over Canada. It's pretty interesting. So, as the title says, though, we're kind of here to talk about wreck and I don't have a whole ton to talk about except for some new developments that actually came around just the last couple of weeks with Gary LeFay's new model. And I'll talk about that here in a second. But for those of you that don't know, Wreck E was identified in the very first lake survey. It's in the proximity of Valcour Bay, incredibly deep water, somewhere in the 250 range, I believe. And then they sent an ROV down the next year and discovered that it's, in fact, P-239, 104-foot U.S. Air Force aircraft rescue boat. And this is the one that I had actually talked to Chris about in 2020. Because before the Sea Scout, this is the only boat in the archaeological, only crash boat, sorry, I should say, 104-foot crash boat in the archaeological record. There's another one somewhere in New Jersey, but I think it's completely disintegrated now at this point. But we have these really interesting photos from 1949, but we can't really tell what type it was. Was it the 235A? Was it 235C? Or was it maybe a 235B, which may or may not exist? We don't actually have any records of if there being a 235B, but it's hypothetical if there's an A and a C. And there's so many records missing already from this design that it's possible. So if we look at these new images from Gary, we can see, so for a while it was believed that the hole that we see here at the Shelburne shipyard was in the crew quarter. However, once I started taking a look at these new photogrammetry models, I realized that that's actually not correct. It is actually right here at the pilot house. And underneath the pilot house is in fact the officer and engineer's quarters, the galley, and the officer's latrine. The crew quarters is actually right here. There's just one very thin bulkhead separating the two of them. But I was able to figure out that it is sort of this area right here, which I think is really interesting, that's right underneath this pilot house. Sort of makes me think that maybe it was used for target practice, because it was being used at Plattsburgh Air Force Base at the time. And these were already being phased out. But there's some interesting features here. The litter hatch and then these ladder hatches actually correspond with the 235C. So it's a later variant, which is incredible because this is actually the earliest known number of the 235C design built. We knew that a few numbers after this is when they sort of started to pick up, but P239 is now the earliest number, if it is in fact a 235C design, that we know of. And this is, this just came out 3.5 weeks ago. So we now know that this is pretty remarkable that we know just a little bit more about this boat. So getting pretty close to wrapping up here, and I just really want to include a nod to Czar and our friend here in Lake Champlain. A later variant of a crash boat was used during the search for Champ in 1988. They're deploying some side scan sonars here, and in fact, it actually was also a Sea Cadet vessel from New Jersey. It's an 85-foot variant. It's just really nice, like really good shape. It sort of has more of that 104-foot design to support those larger crews, but Czar, like, was telling me that apparently the owner had this so well tuned that they actually had to deploy this pontoon boat to slow the boat down to collect the side scans data. So I don't think did you guys find Champ? Was there good evidence? Yeah?
He's in a little rubber ducky pond behind my house.
Oh, okay. Okay, so you guys did find him. Yeah, all right. Well, that's just for us.
Whiskers, but he's doing well.
Yeah, great. I'm really glad to hear it. So I really thank you all for coming. If you want to reach out to me and have more questions about crash boats that we can address right now, let me know. But we have about 15 minutes. Perfect for some questions. Yeah.
So when these things were on rescue duty, what sort of crew, how many people did it take to run the boat, and did they have medical personnel as well on board?
Yeah, so actually all of the crew was medically trained. They had 2 officers, 2 engineers, and this is for the 104 foot. I don't know what the smaller ones were, and I believe another 8 on board. So I think it was about 12 in total. Yeah, 10 to 12 in total. And all of them were medically trained to some degree or another. Yeah.
Have you ever had a chance to ride on?
I have not actually. I'm really disappointed about it. So there is still one. I believe it's a 63-foot variant. It's P520. That is a living museum, or there's some recent drama around that about the owner, and it went up for auction. I don't know if it's still operating as a living museum right now, but I would love to go see one. I do know there is one in the San Francisco Bay Area where I'm from. In fact, it's in Stockton where some of these 104 foots were built, which I think is incredibly fascinating that somehow it ended up right back where it was. And I have talked to that individual about checking out his boat, but unfortunately we never made it happen. So I would love to though. Yeah, they'd be great. Yeah, one day.
Like the 85 footers, how much did they draw?
Oh, off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you. I'm more familiar with the 104s.
How much did they draw?
You mean by horsepower?
No, sorry. How deep did they go?
Oh, how deep was their draft? Oh, you know what? I have it right here. It's only about like 4 feet.
Yeah, so not
Yeah,
much.
not
Did
at all.
they not carry launches, or did they carry launches as well? How did they actually get crew out of the planes and onto them and so forth?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So on this one, you can't really see it on the because this is the 235C. The 235A did have some launches. They did have a small. It's not drawn in here, but they did have a small lifeboat that they would go and pick up crews on, and sometimes they would carry rafts, and they would have all assortment of ladders and things like that. Yeah.
In this photogrammetry model, is that piece scabbed on over the hull?
What do you mean?
Well, there's the piece of lighter wood that kind of goes over the bottom of the gaping hole, and you can see it actually laps over the...
Right here, yeah. You know what? You want to see something? It's right there.
And so it's just popped out?
It just popped out. Yeah, I couldn't explain that. I mean, these things were built with plywood, basically.
It's really interesting that this hole looks like it was an explosion or something was torn out of there, but then obviously in the 3D model, it's been cleaned, that cut's been cleaned out, kind of. you know, they took it through the deck
A
of.
little bit, yeah, a little, I mean,
All that
this
number.
does look pretty clean to me, to the bulkhead still,
But there's still
but,
deck there, and now the deck's.
oh yeah, no, the deck's all gone.
Interesting.
So no idea what they did, or how they did it. It could have been, that could be the deck right there, it could have just rotted away.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, these things were incredibly thin hull, which is why those E-boats and the U-boats were such huge threats. Anything shooting at them would have just gone right through the hull.
So, aside from Stockton, do you know what other shipyards these were manufactured in?
Massachusetts, I can't remember where, and another one in Seattle. These 104s were, because that's sort of my specialty is the 104 foot. Not incredibly well documented, but they do sort of show up here and there. So Stephen Bros in Stockton was a big one. That's the one I'm familiar with because the Hagen Museum in Stockton actually provided me a lot of those sources because the other shipyards documents have just kind of disappeared. You know, even Miami shipbuilding or boat building, nobody knows where their records went, which is wild considering, you know, Darren Long was actually a pretty well-known designer during that time.
Are there any photos that exist? Were they using razzle-dazzle camouflage at all on crash boats?
I've never seen any. I think maybe that's just because they were moving so fast that it might kind of make the effects not very good. Like I might kind of cancel out the effects because you would just see it moving. But I've never seen it. No. Most of them were apparently painted in pretty bright colors so they could be spotted easily by, you know, the air crews or the PBM mariners and things like that. Yeah. So, the other one I saw was like grays and blues. I've never seen the brass and basil.
So it's sitting on the bottom, Breckie is sitting on the bottom like that?
Yeah,
And
that's exactly like that, which is pretty crazy compared, you know, seeing as it's like almost identical to how it was in Shelburne. So I have no idea how they got it from one side of the wreck to the other. Maybe it sank while they were towing it. Sort of like a similar story to the CV that's on the other side of the lake from here. Who knows, maybe they were taking it back to Plattsburgh and it sank. It didn't make it. I have no idea.
Seems like maybe they sank it on purpose if in such deep water.
Yeah,
Scuttle.
yeah. It could be. I really couldn't tell you. That is one of the things that we, me specifically, really want to dig into. I know, Chris, you're also pretty interested in trying to figure out what's going on with this guy. So at some point, we will get down. It's probably going to be a big trip to the National Archives for me because none of these records have been digitized yet. They have hundreds of these documents related to these things, and almost none of them are digitized. There's actually an amazing website called uscrashboats.org, which was their creator of that. Carlos was incredibly helpful for helping my thesis because I was doing it during the pandemic. And you know, he lives down in Florida, so occasionally he gets up and he's able to digitize a couple of things, but most of the time he kind of relies on people sending him records. And he actually has a really good digital archive of the manuals for the equipment and the crews and things like that. And that was a huge help for me when, you know, writing a thesis during the pandemic. There's not a lot of sources to access, and I think National Archives actually opened back up in November of 21, about 5 months before I finished my thesis. So at that point I was like, and they just emailed me back. They're like, none of this is digitized. You could pay us $800 to do it. I'm like, no. And wait maybe a year. So, hopefully one day though, we'll know about E-235 and what happened to it actually. Well, yeah, thank you so much for the information.